Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue, and today I am going to bring you V-Ray scans. I've been wanting to try these for a while, and I noticed that there is a trial, so I downloaded the trial, played around with them for a bit, and am reporting back to you, faithful Pixel Fonduers. Anyway, so yeah, what are they? Are they useful? How much do they cost? Can you manipulate them at all? And what kind of variety do we have? So let's just start on the Chaos Group website. And in fact, I'm going to read a quote I found, I think, in the documentation that, or at least one of the little blurbs about it, that kind of explains what it is. So they're talking about the scan material simply stores information about the way a physical material responds to light at individual points on the surface. It has no notion of components that extend across the surface, such as diffuse or reflection qualities, or normal or bump maps. The scanned material is simply a faithful representation of how each point on the object responds to light. So they've got some sort of scanning device, obviously, and they're scanning in a bunch of materials. And what they're saying is it's not really broken out into components like you would have with some sort of PBR rendering, although you do have some control over some of those components, which I'll show you in a moment. But it's just it's just a sort of a custom bit of data for each of these specific materials and how they respond to light, and they've integrated that into their rendering engine. And if you look on their page here, there's a few key features brought out. GPU support for V-Ray Next, which current version you would get for all the different platforms. And it probably works for V-Ray 3, 3.6 and MODO, which is prior to Next, and that has some GPU rendering as well. It does have a few limitations, though, which I discovered sort of by accident, and that are actually significant. So I'm going to be talking about that a little bit. And maybe that's just a MODO thing, but it's definitely something I noticed. Volumetric translucency, that is not something I was able to find a good sample material for, although I did see some sort of simple translucency or thin surface translucency, and I'll show some samples of that. But the fact that it can have volumetric translucency built into this physically based material is pretty amazing. And as you might suspect, the materials really depend on using real-world surface scale, so that's important when you're dealing with your scenes. And if you're doing a lot of product rendering, they're already most likely built at real-world scale anyway, so it's not something you're probably going to have to worry too much about. So incredibly photoreal, definitely, and physically accurate, definitely. There are a couple of render elements. I'm not sure how useful they are, but we can take a look at that a little bit. So they've got triplanar mapping and tileable mapping, both of those, UV mapping, both of those work quite well. I can show you that stuff. Easy to use and customizable. All this stuff is pretty much true. Customizable, again, there's some caveats there I'll have to dive into a little bit, but you have all these different types of materials, right? And we can take a look at some of these materials on V-Ray here. Let's look at the material library. And like anything with V-Ray or Chaos Group, it's really well documented. And they do a really good job getting all this information out there. There's tons of videos and things like that. They also have a scanning service. So if you're working at a company and you've got a product and have some cool materials, or some materials you'd really like scanned and have physical representations of them rather than trying to replicate it in something like a PBR workflow, they can do that for you. And they really have a ton of materials. So what's interesting, these are quite a bit different than something you would maybe see, not necessarily quite a bit different, but they're different than something you might see on Megascans or even Substance, where they're just absolutely pristine looking materials. They're really meant for product rendering, automotive rendering, and like architectural rendering. Whoops, scooch that out a little bit. And they're not messed up at all, although you can combine them with other materials and maps to a degree in MODO. So V-Ray will render it, so we can take a look at that a little bit. When you do the trial, I don't think you have access to all of those materials, but you do have access to quite a few. And you can download these from the website. You can go to categories here like car paint or fabric or leather. You can also go to like metal and pick by type or whatever, or by color. So it's sort of a similar browser to what you would see for something like Megascans. You could look at automotive or interior design. So we go automotive and paint maybe. See some stuff. Clear out some of these guys. But anyway, there's a decent browser here. At the end of the day, you do have to download these either one at a time. Perhaps you can download them in clusters with the actual bought version, but the trial version, I just downloaded these one at a time. And it doesn't have some sort of cool importer thing like Quixel Bridge or something like that. So you're really just downloading them from a website and unzipping them and bringing them into your scene. So I'm thinking I'm going to pop over to Photoshop real quick and we just take a look at some of the renders I've done here. First of all, this shader ball scene is awesome. I found this on the V-Ray forums. This was made by Muhammed, I believe. Yeah, Muhammed. And he put this out there to be downloaded, and he's this V-Ray expert I see on the forums a bit, but he was nice enough to put this out there. So it's perfectly UV mapped. It's this cool shader ball, and so you can download that like I did, and I used it for these test renders here. So I just layered a bunch of these up in Photoshop, and I did render them at 4K, so you can zoom in quite a bit and take a look. Everything in here except the background cyc is a VR scan. Not these guys, these are not, but this thing at the bottom is, and all the pistons are, and the main shader ball, they're all VR scans. So let me just pull back just a little bit here. Yeah, so we've got some foam, copper, so there's nothing super special about the metals that I really noticed other than they just work. They look like nice pristine metal. Lots of different plastic and textured plastic, like this nylon plastic here, which is really useful. This is some blue car paint. Here we just have some blue paint, and again you can see sort of textured in there, a little bit of like a flaky looking material, which is kind of interesting. Carbon fiber, and you can mess with the scale here. That may be a little too big for the carbon fiber, but yeah, no, not sure what that is. Some carpet maybe. You can see the detail though, again, like pushing in really tight here. It just looks really real. And it doesn't have a roughness value. It just has a measured index of refraction, and that's how it's reacting to light, and they've integrated that into their system there. Cork, I didn't really think that one looked that good, as a matter of fact. The fabrics look amazing. Again, like just the detail in the fabrics is pretty amazing. And if you look at the edges here, it's got this sort of fuzzy displaced edge. So it's really, this is just a polygonal sphere. It's a little bit easier to see. Well, there you can kind of see a little bit here. But yeah, there's a fuzziness to it. It's really, really accurate. Some more fabric. Again, that sort of fuzziness on the side. And that sort of displacement you're seeing. So it's got a displacement effect on there as well. Keep going through here. Some more foam. Foil. Yes, we got foil in case you need that. Now, foil, like again, this may be something that's not super easy to create manually, and it's just, looks pretty great right off the bat as a downloaded scan material. So there you can see some benefit for using scanned materials there, where something like this graphite is probably fairly easy to create a facsimile of using your standard sort of PBR workflow with a diffuse material in Octane or V-Ray or MODO or whatever. The screen paint, I mean, that's a pretty sophisticated looking material there. And you can see how it changes color as we go towards the glancing angles, and it's got this sort of swirly attribute in there. It's got this shiny, like super high gloss clear coat, but also a different layer of roughness in there that's spreading it out. The ceramic is pretty realistic. You got some more fabric. This kind of looks like it's kind of cool looking fabric. Again, you can kind of see the fuzziness on the edges a little bit. Things like this hologram. This would be really difficult to create with standard methods, and scanned, it's just right from any angle. Probably looks really cool when it's rotated. That some of the woods, like this maple, again, it looks okay. This oak looks quite a bit better. There's quite a few woods on there. I'm guessing not a huge variation in the grain due to the size of the scanned sample, but looks good. All right, got some pink plastic, red car paint, red glossy plastic. Here you see some flakes. And I appreciate that. I mean, that's just some nice detail in that plastic, and that definitely looks, the detail of the flakes and everything just looks better than just a standard sort of plastic material you may whip up in MODO or Octane or V-Ray, really quickly. There's some leather. This might have a little bit of a displacement on it as well, maybe not. And yeah, there's some more foil effects. There's just a bunch of stuff. There's also a nice bit of fabric in the draped over the top of this thing in the shader ball scene from Muhammed, so that's another reason to get it. And again, this is sort of like a velvety looking fabric that's been scanned in. Sometimes this sort of specular look is difficult to achieve, but with the scan material, it just comes in kind of perfectly, kind of like the AFX materials. Although it just seems like there's a lot more available V-Ray scanned presets than AXF. At AXF, there's maybe a dozen or two ones you can download for free if you can dig them up. But V-Ray has hundreds or thousands of these scanned, thousands actually. Another cloth, a nice looking cloth material, and you can see the sort of raised surface in there. And you can have transparency as well. So this is just this perforated cloth material. Looks pretty good. Let me just go back to 4K here. I mean, you can see it's just really good. And look at the detail, like the little tiny bumps and everything, and the perforations. Can't really beat these scan materials if they fit your product. This is one that has some interesting translucency, where you can see, as it goes to a sort of a Fresnel angle here, as it folds over, there's less translucency or transparency, but it's pretty thin when you look at it straight on. You can see the shader ball underneath, or the the piston there, and there's obviously some complex specular highlighting going on with these speckles and stuff like that. I mean, that's a pretty complex looking material. I got to hand it to them. Some more fabric here. I've integrated it with some shader tree work to show you that you can put a logo on something, because if you're doing product work, then you're invariably going to have to put logos or labels on the product, and there's some ways to do that. And it's, I'll show that a little bit in MODO, I think, because that's important to be able to do. There it is again on a fabric. There it is. These are actually blended materials. So this is a sort of a fabric, white fabric with these little circular knobs on it on this red plastic. This is a car paint that I added 3 layers of speckles, these speckled flakes to, with the V-Ray blended material and the V-Ray flakes material. So again, you can blend these with additional materials, and then the white is actually the same blue car paint using a parameter called paint color, where you can change the colors. Now I'll get into that in a bit as well. Here's one more where I just, if you look, this is actually the white leather material from way back. I had shown way back somewhere else. Way back here, maybe I could find it real quick. Yeah, here it is. So there's white leather, right? Let me push out a little bit. And what I did here is I recolored the white leather with this UV image from the MODO image assets library. And so you can recolor with just a color, or you can recolor with a texture, but we'll get into that in a minute as well. So there it is in Photoshop. We can go over to MODO and take a look at how it works in practice now. All right, here we are in MODO. Here's Muhammad's nice scene here. You can see the camera and the background cyc, and yeah, they're really cool looking. I mean, look at the detail on the shader ball. Really cool. So, and we've got the shader ball here, which has this group mask here. There's also a cloth in the scene, so you got this little cloth draped over the top right here, which is nice and useful for all the fabric materials that we're going to take a look at. And there's the cloth item mask. So how does this work? Let me just hide the cloth, and we'll just look at the shader ball. So I go over here to the shader ball item mask, and I go up to add layer, V-Ray materials, and I know this is off the screen a little bit, but there's one called V-Ray scanned. So click that. Let me just sort of push this up so I can see everything. See it turned black because the V-Ray scanned is not referencing a file yet. And so at the very top here, a file browser. Hit browse, and my V-Ray scans are just all in this directory. These are ones I downloaded from the Chaos Group website. What's nice is in the zip there's these little ping files, so you can see a good sized thumbnail of the V-Ray scan file. And so let's take a look at this paint here, which is pretty complex looking material. So I'm going to open the V-Ray scan file. You can see it in the right here in the properties, and starts rendering it. There's a little thing here called Show V-Ray Scan Material Info, so I'm going to click that. And it says the physical size of the scan. I'm guessing the swatch of paint was about 10.7 by 9.9 centimeters. It talks a little bit about the maps, has a height map, translucency map, no, opacity map, no, paint map, no, fuzzy, no, flakes, no. So, you never see maps, so to speak, as always just this one layer here with all the data. Just being presented in the render view. There's no like maps like you would find in your typical shading workflow, even though it says there's a height map there. Now there are some options to deal with these parameters. But one of the things you need to do is make sure you get the scale correct, right? So the scale of the shader ball is actually 50 millimeters. So if I kind of push out, maybe I'll go to like wireframe view, where it's a little bit easier to see the wireframes. And if I pull back, you'll see, at 50 millimeters and the grid size, that's the same size of this shader ball here. And if you remember, this one is like 10 by 10, right? 10 by 10. And so there is a difference in size here. And you really want to get your scale correct if you're doing product rendering or automotive rendering or, that kind of thing. You can't just use your artistic sense. If you need to see what the leather looks like on the interior of the car, you really need the right scale. So there's a way you can kind of do this. If I select this, now I'm supposed to be in polygon mode, technically, so I'm in polygon mode now. And over here on the V-Ray scan material, it says adjust UV tiling to match real-world size. So I can do that. And if I look over here at the UV tiling, it's just 1 and 1. And so I hit adjust UV tiling, and what it says is tiling for V-Ray scanned set to 1.12 times 1.1248. And so that should be the same sort of, or 1.12 to 1.248. So the same sort of dimensions or ratio as that scanned material, which is like 10 millimeters to 9 millimeters. But, this is 50 millimeters, and so it's still 5 times as big. And it does not change that for you. It does not change this tiling factor. So I'm going to change that to 5 because this 50 millimeter ball obviously is bigger than the 10 millimeter swatch. And so we should have the ratio of the swatch set in our UV repeats here, the 10 to 9 ratio. And then, the actual tiling factor should really match the scale. I wish you would do that automatically, but it just doesn't seem to do it. And this is really what the paint should be looking like here at this scale of 50 millimeters for this ball. So, all right, looks pretty cool. And, there it's on there. And this is the tiling factor. We also have triplanar mapping available to us, which I think I'll just show. Let me just stop this, show you in a different scene just to make it a little more obvious how that works. Obviously, if you're doing a lot of CAD files, triplanar mapping is something you're going to perhaps be encountering quite a bit if you don't do nice looking UV maps in all your objects. So if we go over here, let me just go to this other scene right here. I've got this little ball here. This is the same 50 millimeter sized ball. And I can just fire up my V-Ray rendering over here. And I've got a different V-Ray scanned material on there. And this is with, let me just push up. Here's my V-Ray scan material. And here I'm using just the tiling. I'm not using triplanar mapping. Now if I click triplanar mapping, let me just go back to tiling. So I can, of course, ramp up the tiling and I get nice tiles here. Triplanar mapping is it's just gonna give me one, like, just project it once on each axis. Typically there's a blend value that you can adjust, and I just don't see that anywhere on here. So there's no way. Usually there's like a little blend value, like where these edges come together. So let me just increase the wrapping here, like 2. And you can see these seams here where it comes together. Typically with triplanar mapping, you'll be able to do like a 10% blend or 15% blend along these edges, so they sort of fade into each other nicely. And on natural looking textures like rocks or maybe even wood, you don't really notice it. You would notice it on something like this, a very distinct pattern. But the fact that there's no blending at all, at least that I can see, is not a great thing. It seems like there should be blending. There's a couple of random offset and random rotation options here, which may be nice if you've got a bunch of these different balls in the scene. I suppose it could do that and add some randomness to the scene. But there's not a lot of, there's no blending option, which is not great. So I could turn this off and just go back to the regular tiling factor. In fact, I'm going to stop this and go back to our nice scene. Okay, here we are back in the original scene. Let's try a different scan and try a couple of new options. I'm going to pick, I'll pick one of these fabrics. Maybe this gray, well, let's see. Have we done this one yet? Let me pick this one. I like this one. So here we've got this sort of gray fabric. Let me fire it up. And we'll take a look at a couple of these other options here that we have. One of the nice things is you can create an OpenGL preview of these. Like I said, there's no maps associated with these files. all the data is just actually in the file, and it's packed into this one shader here. But as soon as this pops up with this gray fabric, I will show you what you can do in terms of getting that into your scene, so you can see it in your OpenGL view as well, which is kind of nice. So there it is, and you have this little button here, Create OpenGL Preview. So, and there's a preview size. So I'm going to bump that up to like 512, and I click that button, and you can see what it did over here is it popped it up into the preview window. It just had a little like swatch, and it set it to luminous color. These aren't rendering in the V-Ray view, but they are just visible in OpenGL. Had a little new material in there, so it's pretty nice. You can just, it's a nice thought of a Chaos group to allow us to see these scanned materials in our OpenGL group in the window as well by just hitting this button. It'll create a material for you that doesn't render but does show up in OpenGL. So I think that's pretty cool. So pushing into this a little bit, this one actually has a bit of a bump on it. We'll take a look at the VR scan material info, and get a height map, but it kind of looks like this, similar to the last one. What about changing colors? Because that's something you're going to be doing a lot if you are, getting one of these materials like a leather or a plastic or a metal, and you need to change the color a bit. And so this is where I bumped into a little bit of an issue. So there's a couple ways to change the color. You've got to use filter and use paint. So filter will actually tint a color. So let me get, maybe again, let's try a different material. Let's maybe try a white something or other, just maybe this fabric white right here. So we get an idea of, oh, that's kind of interesting. It just automatically pops up because when we switch the scan material, because I have this scene preview in here, it automatically updates that. How nice. That was pretty nifty. So here we are, right? And so I want to change this color. So I can use paint. So I can click use paint, and I can pick a paint replacement color. So let's pick red. And you can see it changing over here, which is cool. And what's happening in the viewport? Well, calculating something, and it's looking kind of red. So what's interesting about this is I found sometimes this works great using GPU rendering, and sometimes it doesn't appear to work at all using GPU rendering. So let's try, for instance, an image map. So if I pop open my images over here, I've got a couple maps in the scene. I have this one right here, this UV map, and I can drag this into the shader ball on the shader tree. And it's set to diffuse color initially. You see it overriding over here in the viewport. But I can right click and I can go down to V-Ray scanned overrides. And I know this is off the screen here, but there's two options. Typically like you have in basic channels, you would have diffuse color and luminous color and reflection amount and things like that. For the V-Ray scanned materials, you only have two options: V-Ray filter color, or V-Ray scan filter color, and V-Ray scan paint replacement color. So I'm going to do paint replacement color. And our V-Ray scan material has use paint on. And so you can see that this right now is over in the viewport is what I should be seeing right here in the window, but it's not. And if I stop it and re-render this using the CPU instead of the GPU, I believe it's going to work. So what it's telling me is that you can change paint colors just as pure RGB value, and it'll render on GPU. But if you try to change the color using a texture, it only renders on CPU. And so this may be an issue with just MODO, or it may be an issue with all versions of V-Ray, V-Ray Next, that are only rendering that particular effect on CPU now. So here I'm rendering the CPU, and it's working. So that really threw me for a loop there, because I couldn't figure out why this wasn't working, and I finally go over to CPU rendering, because if you've used V-Ray long enough, you know that you should always try CPU rendering if something's not working in GPU, because they haven't necessarily moved all of their technology over to GPU yet. And there it is. Now I can also, it does have a couple of other parameters here. I can adjust the gamma correction and the saturation, which is nice to have, so I can maybe bump up the saturation a little bit to like 1.5, looks a little bit better, and I can adjust maybe the gamma a little bit to like 1.2 or something like that. And so you do have a lot of control over it, but that whole like GPU, CPU thing, working with a simple color but not working with textures, it threw me off a bit. And you might be asking, what's the difference between filter and paint? Well, paint appears to really change the color of the diffuse component, without changing the reflection colors of these materials. And filter really just seems to act as sort of a tint, so it sort of shifts everything over. So if I maybe turn these off and just look at the scan material, turn off use paint, and maybe pick a new material like we'll do this pink fabric here. In fact, why don't I keep this white and then turn on my cloth here, and then I'll go over here and I'll add in my cloth item mask, I'll do a recent. So where's recent? V-Ray scanned. And then I'll load up that pink material. I'm doing it in recent V-Ray scanned. There it is. So let me grab that pink fabric there, sort of velvety looking fabric. And I'm still in, what am I? I'm still in CPU rendering. And so since my CPU is 8 cores, but I have two 1080 Ti's in here, I think I'll go back to GPU rendering because it's going to be faster. And also we'll let that load up. And we'll take a look at a couple of things here in regards to both the filter color and also adding logos and things like that to these V-Ray scan materials. And we could do that 2 different ways. There's 2 different techniques that I found work pretty well with that. So let me let this fire up the rendering or get going here, get the data to the GPU and start rendering. Okay, so it's cooking away in the GPU. You can see like my, again, my, it may be nice to go over here and check my dimensions just to see if this looks a little bit small to me. So I see a little too bumpy, so I should check this VR scan material info. You know, this was a 15 by 15 approximately centimeter swatch that they scanned. I've got a 50 centimeter, 50 centimeters or 50 millimeters? Actually, I think I have 50 millimeters. So this is, which is 150 centimeters. So, right. So this is actually kind of big. So it needs to be smaller. So I need to tile it by about 3, or I could do that thing where I hit adjust UV first. And so it adjusts the tiling down a little bit, I suppose. And then I'll just maybe tile it by 3 here, adjust my ratio of my horizontal wrap and vertical wrap to match the scanning surface dimensions, and then I'll tile it correctly for the dimensions of the swatch versus the size of my object in the scene. That looks a little more realistic. Okay. Didn't really have to do that for a sample, I guess, but it's probably good practice to do that if you're using scanned materials, just to make sure the materials are correct in your scene. Let's go to, so let's go to use filter and see what this does. So I click use filter, defaults to white, and if I go over to green, what happens? Well, turns kind of yucky reddish green, right? So tinting it, I guess, but maybe not. That's not what we want. The idea behind paint, I think, is supposed to be a little more accurate. So let's just try paint and try to get that same sort of green color, see if that works better. And again, I'm going to test this on CPU as well. So paint, obviously, using paint gives us much closer approximation of what I'm really looking for as a green cloth here. And filter, again, it just seems to do a sort of almost like a post-processing sort of tint or hue rotation on it, and you get something a little bit different, although I see the glancing angles, it's much more green. Now I'm just curious, if I hit stop and render this in CPU, is it going to look the same as the GPU? Or is it another one of those deals where it's just accurate in CPU? We'll find out. So let's go to start V-Ray RT CPU and just see if it looks the same sort of muddy color or if it's more of a green, just to make sure tint is working. So tint works the same way. So it's really just the maps, I guess. It's really just if you want to map it up here using a paint map, paint replacement map, where it's really only working in CPU. Everything else seems to work in GPU. So that's the difference between tint and use filter and use paint. Paint is probably what you're typically going to want, but filter just gives you some variation. Obviously, you can get some interesting artistic values with filter. I'm going to turn that off, and we're going to attempt. Let's go back to GPU, and we're going to attempt to put a Pixel Fondue logo on here. We're going to do this a couple different ways, I guess. One, using a blend material and the paint feature, and then we'll use a blend material with a standard V-Ray material. So take a look at that. So I'm just going to start adding this up over here right now as this is calculating. So I'm just going to add another V-Ray material, and we're going to do just a standard V-Ray material. So it's going to, when I add this, it's going to turn this pink, this white color. Whoops, it came underneath it. So if I pull it on top, you'll see it's turning white. So that's just the standard V-Ray material. Underneath it is the pink scanned material. And what I'll do is I'll add a V-Ray blend material. So under V-Ray materials, there's a V-Ray blend material. I'm going to put that on top. Now it turns black because I haven't selected anything yet. I'll just turn on this guy underneath it. So I'm going to pick my V-Ray scanned as the base. And so V-Ray scanned 5 is that one right there. So V-Ray scanned 5. And you can also do this in the nodal editor if you want to. Is that the one I want? V-Ray scanned 11, not 5. That's some sort of metal I have probably on the pistons. V-Ray scanned 11 should be the pink one right here. And you see that. Again, if I open up the schematic and I drag my blend material in here, and I double click that, you can see it. And so you can put these together in the schematic or the shader tree, however you want to do it. For my coating 1 material, in fact, I'll just do this in the schematic. So I can do my blend, I can pick this V-Ray material 5 right here as my coating 1 material, V-Ray material 5, like that. Or I can actually just, if you prefer the schematic, you can just drag that into the schematic and then hook up your purple graph connector into coat material 1. And it's going to turn that sort of white like that. Let me just sort of push down like that. And you see the blend on the blend material isn't fully white. It's about 75%. So if I go 0%, it's going to go, back to pink. And if I go 100%, it's going to go all white, this V-Ray material here. And so what you may need to do is, for instance, put like a white logo or a black logo on your product. And so I can do that by adding another layer, and I'll just add an image map, and I'll use my clip browser here, and I'll just grab this pixel fondue image at the top. You can see it over here in the UV mapping there. So when I just up the UV mapping a little bit, maybe 2 by 2, and then I'll just move these offsets around so I can see it sort of in the middle there. I'll look through the camera. Let me just adjust these offsets a little, something like that. Sort of see it a little bit better. And maybe I'll just make this 3. See if I can get a better looking. See if we can see pixel fondue there. I wonder if I can rotate that map. Yes, I can. V-Ray, allowing me to use MODO rotation and offset values for the win. Good job, V-Ray. Okay, so there it is. And I just have to right click on here. I need to set this to the coat material amount. And I can either do that by right clicking over here, and I could set this effect this way, or I could also, again, do it in the schematic. So if I go over here to V-Ray blend material channels, I know this is off the screen. V-Ray blend amount 1 is the one we want. And then this will update here. And if I want this switched, of course, I could just hit invert, and it'll give me a white pixel fondue logo of this sort of base V-Ray material on top of this, this pink scanned material. And of course, I can always just change my material color if I want to make this black or shiny or whatever, right? So that's one way to put labels and logos on your V-Ray scanned materials. You do it with a blend material. And here I blended a V-Ray standard material in with a V-Ray scanned material. But you can use the paint feature on the scanned material and do that as well. So if I need it to be this same sort of fuzzy fabric, this sort of shiny velvety fabric, I can actually duplicate my scan material here. So it's now, I've got scan material 11 or 12. I know that's hard to see on YouTube, but that's just in parentheses 12 there is the name of that material. And I could turn on use paint, and I could make this paint white. And then on my V-Ray blend material, instead of using my standard V-Ray material as a coating material, I just want to use V-Ray scan material 12 right there. And again, you can do this in the schematic if you prefer the schematic. If I look at the schematic, push back a little bit, I can see here's my base material, V-Ray scanned 11, and here's my V-Ray scanned 12 is in the coat material. Let me just unplug that base connection that came in when I duplicated it. And then our amount texture, it's not, you don't see in the schematic, it's in here in the shader tree, but you can do it either way. I could hook it up to the schematic as well. So the important thing is, if I go to, let me just hide the schematic. If I go to a render region here, and I push in a little bit, I'm using that same scanned material. So all the little bumps and that nice sort of velvety reflection texture is going to be in my logo, as well as the pink around it. So again, that's just another way to do it. And you can add other V-Ray materials as well. So I can, for instance, let me just turn off the render region there, and I'm going to turn off my cloth. And so I have my base shader ball. So let's take one last example here of adding some flakes to this nice red car paint here. So if we want to add some flakes on here, what do we do? Well, again, we can use the V-Ray blend material. So I'll go over here, add layer, recent, V-Ray blend. Now I'm going to put the base material as the V-Ray scan 5 here. So V-Ray scan 5 down here at the bottom. V-Ray scan 5. I actually want this on top of that in the shader tree because, again, we're being read from the bottom up. And so there we go. And then I'll need a new coat material. And the coat material will be a flake. And so let's go over here to add layer. And under V-Ray materials, we have a V-Ray flakes material. And here it popped in underneath the V-Ray blend. So let's add this as our first coat material, V-Ray flakes right there. And you should see this pop up here in a second. The V-Ray flakes actually have a built-in sort of alpha, and you see the flakes there, right there on top of this guy. This is, let me just check. I think I had turned denoising back on at some point, which denoising actually can kind of kill flakes. I've noticed it just kind of looks like noise to the denoiser. Wait, where am I at here? So let's go to main settings here. Let's turn off the denoising on this actual scene here so our flakes don't get denoised into oblivion. So here's our flakes, looking pretty good. And I could just adjust the scale here on flakes. So flake scale maybe 0.003 or so. They should be a lot smaller than that. I'll make them a little bit bigger because YouTube compression may kind of kill them. Actually, that's not so bad. And so instead of purple or bluish, what do we do with sort of a gold looking flake here in the red paint? And then I can add really as many of these as I want. So why don't I'll do a render region so this renders a little bit quicker in this live demo here. So you see the gold flakes there. And I can just Control D, duplicate the flakes, go to my blend material. We'll just do coat material 2 as flakes 2, like so. And I can adjust, of course, I can turn this all the way up if I want. And flakes 2, let's make them maybe sort of a greenish yellow, and you'll see both of these coming in. So now we've got 2 different flakes in there. I can also change the flake seed, some random numbers so they're offset. And again, this is just another way to customize. You can kind of see these offset in there. Why don't I change this to maybe sort of a blue, so a little more obvious what's what. Since we've got sort of a gold flake and a blue flake, we'll make the blue flake a little smaller maybe. Not sure how they do these flakes in real life. I think it's maybe suspending mica or something in the actual paint layer. But you know, there you've got the blue flakes and the gold flakes, and you could just keep doing this if you want to. Now there are some additional parameters for V-Ray scanned I haven't gotten to down here at the bottom. Besides paint and filter, we just sort of hide the these two here so we can see what we've got down here at the bottom. Clearcoat. We've got some adjustments. Now, you know, we have an index of refraction and a bump multiplier and the strength of the clear coat, and these came in with a scan material. And you're also going to see on some of the fabrics and things like that, there's sort of a bump mapping setting and a parallax setting that you can adjust, but honestly, they should kind of come in perfect. So, you know, perhaps you'd want to try to adjust the bumps on something like a nubbly plastic material to get them to show up more, but you know, in the real, like, sort of ideal world, everything just kind of comes in perfectly. But it does give you some chance to mess with this. So if I turn the Clearcoat Strength down to 0.1, let's just see if we lose some of that gloss off of there. So hit that, and is it going to do anything? Yeah, it does. So you can see quite a bit of difference between, you know, the clear coat outside the render region and the clear coat in the inside. So, you know, you can adjust these scan materials a bit. You know, there's not a huge amount of leeway for adjusting them, but, you know, changing the paint color, tinting with the filter color, adjusting the strength of the clear coat and some of the bumps and stuff like that, blending it with other V-Ray materials, or blending it back with recolored versions of itself with a logo as a matte. Things like that will allow you to do some stuff with these V-Ray scans that'll sort of bring it into your workflow, and if you're doing products or whatever else. And I've got to say, I mean, it's pretty nice just to download a material. There's no maps to deal with, right? There's not all these like different maps if you're doing like a mega scan or anything. It's just this one file. You just point it to a file and it just sort of looks like near perfect right off the bat. There's something very appealing about that. In fact, the bottom of this base here is another V-Ray scan material. So, would you get it? And that's really sort of the big question here. Looking back at the website, there are just a ton of different scans here. I can't remember exactly how many, but I think there's several thousand. So I can look at product design here. We've got some good samples of what can be done, and it's impressive, right? So like these plastics are going to have just a lot of detail on them. You can kind of see that, and it just comes with a scan material. So what's the catch, right? Are they super expensive? Well, yeah, it's kind of expensive. So I look at, if I go over here to buy, see if we can just kind of find it here, buy online. We have commercial products. And, V-Ray is typically, $350 to $470 for max annually. V-Ray for MODO, $350. By the way, if you do a lot of rendering, $350 a year is not that much, right? So I bought V-Ray. I use it quite a few projects. V-Ray scans, though, annually is $420 a year. Now, it should give you access, I believe, to the entire library, but it's a lot. I think you can actually download the entire library at once, and so you don't have to keep downloading stuff. And I have no idea how often they put new stuff up there. Like Mega Scans, there's new stuff all the time. Substance, there's new stuff all the time. And they even have like render nodes that'll work with VR scans for another $50 a year. So I don't know if I'd use that. I'd probably just use a GPU rendering. But of course, we run into a couple of instances where GPU rendering, at least with paint maps that don't really work, you have to use CPU rendering. Now you can use V-Ray's render cloud. So if you're at a company of medium to large size, it seems like a really appealing option, right? $350 for a seat. So for like $770, you've got all these scans and V-Ray for MODO for a year. So $750 or $70 a year. Seems like a pretty good deal, but if you're a smaller company, it may be more appealing just to make your own materials in V-Ray or Octane or MODO rather than pay $400 a year, especially because a lot of these materials, like sort of base metals, base plastic materials, are in cheaper libraries you can buy. They probably don't look quite as good. They require more work than the VR scans, but they're free and probably a little more flexible as well. One other thing that I didn't really bring up was, let me just go back to MODO. There are a couple different outputs. We've got a V-Ray scanned zone output and a V-Ray scanned paint mask. Now, if I look at these, again, this is something in GPU rendering. They're just non-existent. They don't show up at all. And if I stop and I render this in the CPU, I get something there. So again, there's just not everything is working with the GPU right now, at least not with for MODO. So I go over here to CPU and fire this back up. I can go into those outputs, here the V-Ray scan paint mask output and the zone output, and I can see something. So again, I don't know how super usable this is. This is the V-Ray paint mask, and so basically it's there's a bunch of different V-Ray scan materials on here, so you can see there's different paint masks for each one. Like this black one, you can see where the texture is. The paint mask is a little, it's showing a paint mask for that. If I go back to the RGB color, so this is a V-Ray scan here at the bottom. Maybe you can push in a little more. Can I push in? It's gonna let me push in. Yeah, so there's a little bit of texture here you see, and that's showing up on the paint mask there, whereas the car paint doesn't quite have that. It's mostly just a solid color. So that's interesting. And the VR, the V-Ray scan zone mask, I'm not sure what that is. It doesn't seem to show anything at all. So I don't know. I didn't see anything in the docs either, although it's probably there because V-Ray does a really good job with the docs. But again, so again, if you invest in expensive GPUs and then you realize that you need to use some of these features and they only work with CPU, it's kind of annoying. This may be fixed in the next version. V-Ray has been putting a lot of effort into moving everything over to CPU, or a GPU, but as of now, they don't seem to work. But again, you get these just beautiful, beautiful materials. So you're really going to have to decide for yourself if it's worth $420 a year. But one thing for sure is they just look really, really good, without a doubt. These just look really, really good. I'm pressing in here. I mean, these are all V-Ray scan materials. These metals in here look good. What can I say? So, that's what I've got for you, and hopefully it's useful if you're looking at, we're interested in what V-Ray scans can do, or if you're looking to buy it.
Yum, yum!